My name's Simon Robertson, and I'm very happy to be here with Patricia Davies and Jean Argles, who during the war were the Owtram sisters, and we're going to talk about their extraordinary war and also about their extraordinary father. If we could start, Pat, with you giving us a picture of what home life was like in the 1930s at Newland Hall.
Well, we grew up in Lancashire, in our grandfather's house, which was in the country near Lancaster, and had a nice big garden and a home farm, and we were quite a big family, so it was a kind of ideal childhood in a way. I didn't go to school till I was 14, and then I did go to boarding school. Till then, my sister Jean and I were educated by a long series of governesses. It seems very old-fashioned now, but in the 1920s, because I was born in 1923, governesses did bring up girls in country families, and I was longing to go to school. Finally got there when I was 14, just for about 3 years.
And Jean, if I could ask you, before your governesses, there were nannies, and you each of you had nannies. There was one in particular that gave you a sort of mantra for life.
Yes, indeed there was. She was looking after both of us. Our brother hadn't been born then, so she was almost like another mother. We spent a lot of time with her. But whenever I had any accident, falling over, which happened quite often, or something like that, she said, "No, don't cry, don't cry. You say, it might have been very much worse." And we said that, and my sister said it too, for the rest of our lives, nearly 100 years.
Extraordinary. And if I could take you now forward to the outbreak of war. Just before the war broke out, you were on a Scottish holiday. Could you, Pat, describe the sort of dramatic scene at the end of the holiday?
Yes, well, because our father was a very keen fisherman, most of our summer holidays were in Scotland or somewhere where he could fish. And we were at Arisaig that summer of 1939, and we used to go and listen to the radio broadcasts in a little farmhouse, and it looked more and more likely that we were about to have a war. And our father was in the Army Reserve as major with a field artillery regiment, so he obviously had to get back as soon as he could to our home, and we drove at great speed, I think. Well, I didn't, he did, but all the way back from the west of Scotland to Lancashire, so that he could then go over to Blackpool and rejoin the regiment.
And I'd now like to talk to you about something that's in sharp contrast with your life in the country. Going to London. Pat, you went to London in 1940. What were you doing in London?
Yes, I had left school, and the family had decided that Jean and I could take secretarial jobs. So I needed a secretarial training, and a college which had been in London called the Triangle had moved out to Buckinghamshire because of the Blitzes. And I'm rather surprised that my mother did agree that I could go off there and learn secretarial work. So I did. I went down to Buckinghamshire and spent that winter at Gerrard's Cross.
And at that time, Jean, you were at school. You were still at boarding school. You were at boarding school at the time that the air raids had started, that the Blitz was going on. And could you talk to us about your memories of seeing Coventry?
Yes, because although I had been up to London, we were at school in Warwickshire, both Pat and I. They looked at other schools, but anyway, that was the one our family decided on. So I was still at the school. Pat had left, I think, at the beginning or quite early on in the war. And so we had the air raids of Coventry and the central part of England, and we used to hear the aeroplanes coming over at night, and we were sent down to the cellars, where we were out of sight, out of mind, and we used to sleep down in the cellar below. But I do remember on one occasion watching the first attack on Coventry from a window halfway down the staircase. I was quickly switched off and taken down. But I suddenly realized then, this is not a joke, this is not a game we're playing, this is a war. And there are people out of this window down there, about 5-10 miles away, and they are losing their lives. So perhaps I saw more of the war as a schoolgirl than I did later.
Well, I think we'll come on to your interesting war shortly. Pat, would you share any of your memories of the London Blitz?
Yes, well, I'm rather surprised that my mother agreed that I could go to a secretarial college near London while all the blitzes were going on in 1940, but she did. And I did the secretarial course, and then I got a job just off the Strand, and I used to commute in from Surbiton. Well, you were expected to do fire watching at that time, and so I used to do fire watching locally in Surbiton, and there were a certain amount of incendiaries, but I never really had any great trouble. The nearest bomb I ever met was actually at my secretarial college, because I had just arrived. They were showing me around because it was residential. The housekeeper took me into a bedroom, and at that moment the window came in like a glass bubble and burst glass all over the room, and a landmine had gone on just outside the window, and the German bombers used to go over there. So the housekeeper and I dived under the bed, and we spent quite a lot of nights there down below in a passage with rather alarming water pipes running along overhead, but it was considered safer than anywhere else in the building. And Surbiton, again, we had to do fire watching duties, but I don't remember ever having to deal with incendiaries, though other people did.
Well, one quick point that I just wanted to pick up, with this being a literary festival, was with your job that you had at that time, you came into contact with a few sort of leading literary figures of the day. Could you share some brief stories about those?
Yes, well, the Secretarial College found you a job at the end of the course, and they found a literary agency for me called Pern, Pollinger and Hyam, and they had a number of authors, including Dorothy L. Sayers, on their books. They had the whole Sitwell family, and they used to come in. I remember Dame Edith, very impressive and rather like a Tudor monarch, and Sashi, who was very nice and easiest to get on with, Osbert, who was rather impressive, but I found him a little scary. We also had the foreign correspondents who were in London covering the war, like Quentin Reynolds, and I used to take their mail and newspapers and things over to the Savoy, where they mostly seemed to be staying. It was quite an interesting time, because the blitzers were going on at night, but, we were lucky where we were, and the building was not damaged or anything. And I rather enjoyed that job, although I was only in it about 6 months.
And then we reach 1941, and your father was due to embark for overseas services, and you went home. Could you talk to me about your father's embarkation, any memories that occur to you? Jean, if we start with you.
Of his embarkation. Yes, well, we knew that he'd gone back into the army. He'd been in the territorials since the end of the First World War, and he had enjoyed the life with them. And so, of course, the moment the Second War started, he rejoined and was ready to go. And my mother was brave and supported him in this, and she was going to be left behind with us to look after. But when we got round first year, really, he was still in England and doing revision work, so to speak, and being a member of the army. And he was having a really wonderful time, and she was encouraging it. But then we came to his farewell, and so we thought, well, I was working in London, I think Pat was too, and so we all came back home to have a farewell party. And I remember it was remarkable how we all worked as one person. We encouraged him, we supported him, and my mother never looked for a moment as if this was a terrible time, but she coped with it wonderfully.
And I think, Pat, you recorded an entry in your diary about feeling that you might all have felt very gloomy, but actually I think your father tried to be sort of quite cheering to everybody, and there was a certain bottle that was opened of the 96 port that your grandfather had kept.
Yes, I do remember very clearly that week when our father was on embarkation leave, and I think because he'd been with his regiment training on Salisbury Plain for a long time, that they were really very enthusiastic about going overseas and actually seeing real service. And probably his mood, was what we caught. And so we didn't feel in any way down about him going. And you're quite right, we did all the ordinary things like going fishing, which he loved, and our grandfather did open his bottle of 96 port just before our father went away, and we saw him onto the train, and we then didn't see him again for a very long time.
Would you be able to talk to us a little about the Malayan campaign that your father was involved in?
Yes, he was in a field artillery regiment, a senior major. They were sent out to Singapore. While they were on their way out, the Japanese came into the war, and when they got to Malaya, the Japanese invaded. They had bombers and tanks, and we didn't have adequate anti-aircraft defences or tanks. So although the British regiments fought as well as they possibly could all the way down the Malayan Peninsula, there was only one outcome, and the Japanese won that campaign. And all the Allied troops were taken prisoner, including our father. By that time, he was commanding officer of the regiment, because Colonel Holmes, who was the colonel of the regiment, was killed by a Japanese tank, and our father, as senior major, had to take over. And they were sent up country to camps along the River Kwai. Well, we know it as the River Kwai. And our father became camp commandant of a very big prisoner of war camp with Allied troops as prisoners who were not only British, but also, so I think, Dutch, Australian, Indian, and quite a mixture of people in this camp.
And I would like to come back to your father's story in Chung Kai, but at the moment we're in 1942. Your father is taken prisoner in around the February of 42, and I believe, reading both of these books, it was something like 3 months before you even had any word whether he was alive or not. How did the information come that he was alive? What did you receive?
Well, my mother depended on telegrams from the War Office, and I think it was 2 months. It was from February till April 1942 before she heard he had survived the Malayan campaign. And then it was a longer time before, several months before she got his first postcard from his prison camp. So
they were very
was all she
basic
knew.
postcards as well, with simply "I'm well."
They were little standard postcards that the Red Cross, I think, provided. And it was just a formula: I am well, I am working, and so on.
Jean, I wonder, would you talk to us about how it felt? You were at school, you were at your boarding school when you received the news that your father was at first missing.
Yes, well, as you can imagine, I was pretty anxious. I was, about 13, 14, something like that. And although we'd waved him goodbye as if he was going to a party almost, I had been very worried about where he was, couldn't hear from him. It was after he left the camp in England. And then we knew that things were going badly, and it was not till, I should think, nearly a year after we had last seen him that we heard he was alive and in the camp. But I do remember after all, I was only 13, I think myself, was spending a good many nights in tears, worrying if he was still there, if we'd ever see him again, had he gone forever. And I got a lot of support, particularly from the nurse for some reason at our boarding school, and she understood nothing was wrong with me, but something was desperately wrong, and she really came to my help. I always remember her.
That's good, that's very good. And Pat, meanwhile, you were very keen to get into uniform as soon as you could. You made a decision to join the Wrens. Why did you choose the Wrens of all the women's services?
Well, my mother had one brother, and he was a destroyer captain when the war started, and he actually sank the first U-boat to be destroyed. And Uncle Charles, who was my godfather, said, of course, the girls will want to join the Wrens. And so I never really had serious thoughts. I did think for a time I might join the WAF, but Uncle Charles's advice really counted for rather more. So the Wrens were all volunteers, and I did, in, I think, 1942, volunteer for the Wrens.
An aunt had made an earlier suggestion via telegram that you didn't think very much of.
Yes, my aunt, who was my godmother, had a husband in the Foreign Office, and she wrote to my mother and said, a lot of the secretaries from the Foreign Office are going to work at a place in the home counties called Bletchley Park, and it would be so nice if Pat went there because she would be with a crowd of jolly girls. Well, I had decided on the Wrens and wanted, if anything, to be on the coast with a lot of jolly sailors and not stuck with a lot of Foreign Office secretaries somewhere in Buckinghamshire. And I had to scotch this idea as quickly as I could. I was away from home, and I sent my mother a telegram which started, "Hate crowds, jolly girls." And you could do, I think, 25 words for some cheap rate. And the young man in the telegraph office said he rather hated crowds of jolly girls too. And thank goodness that was the end of Aunt Ella's suggestion.
You had quite a special qualification that really sort of fast-tracked you into the Wrens. Would you tell me about that sort of specialist qualification and how you came by it?
Well, because my grandfather couldn't get English cooks and housemaids, he discovered an agency which would find Austrian Jewish refugees who hadn't previously been cooks and housemaids but would take these jobs, even in the countryside, in the safety of England. So from then on, he had a series of cooks and housemaids who were Austrian, and when they arrived, they didn't all speak very much English, if any. So what happened originally was that he had taps which had drinking water in them, and which he thought were superior to the mains water supply. And he said, these Austrian people are not going to know which are the drinking water taps. So here are some labels in a German dictionary, and would you tie labels on the taps? So I wrote Wasser für trinken, which is not very good German at all, and tied these on the taps, but it did the job. That made me the family interpreter. And so I spent my evenings, which anyway was much more interesting than anything else, talking with the Austrian refugees and hearing all about the wonderful musical, glamorous life in Vienna. And by the time I joined the Wrens, I could put down conversational German because I was really by then pretty fluent. And I, of course, didn't know that they were looking for young women from safe families who did know German. So I had to do a German test in Liverpool, which was on Port, and I found it fairly easy. And I was then called up, given the general Wrens training, and sent to a little secret establishment in Wimbledon, where we were trained in searching for the German Navy's radio signals and writing down exactly what they said. And that was what I was to do for the rest of the war.
And Jean, Pat was in uniform because she's a little bit older than you are. You were very keen to join up as well, and your first thought was to go into the Wrens. Why didn't you go into the Wrens?
Well, I was terrified of going into the Wrens because I thought it might be full of much more intelligent and able people for a start. And also that I really didn't want to be doing exactly the same thing as my sister, but to be a bit independent. So I was looking round to see what else I could do.
And I think an aunt came up with a suggestion again, another useful aunt.
Yes, this useful aunt came up and said she just heard that there was an organisation called the Fannies. Wasn't quite sure what it stood for, but it was actually the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, founded during the Boer War, when people were dying out on the bushveld and they needed somebody who could ride, hence this came into it, and gallop out and bring these dying heroes back over their horse's neck. And I couldn't do that, but she understood that they were still working and that they were rather interesting, and she gave me the address. So I wrote off to them immediately, saying I don't want to be a cook, which is what everybody else was offering, but what can you offer me? And they offered me a much more interesting sounding career, which I took.
And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, Pat, could you explain to us the kind of work that you were doing in the Wrens?
Yes, I was in what was called the Naval Y Service, the letter Y standing for intelligence, and they had set up 26 little secret listening stations around the east coast and the south coast, from which you could search the frequencies of the German Navy and write down their signals. And these were staffed by German-speaking members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, one Wren officer in charge, one male naval mechanic to keep the radio sets and aerials and everything in good order. And they were very small stations, only about 12 or so linguists, as we were called. We were supported by cooks and stewards. So it was really, a very nice way of spending the war in a way. We worked watches or shifts round the 24 hours. So you would go on at midnight and come off at 4 in the morning, go on again 8 hours later on watch in the watchroom. And the signals we wrote down sometimes were plain language German naval ones like, I have completed mine laying, I'm returning to base. Those we passed on to the nearest Naval Intelligence Office, or they would be in 4-letter Enigma code, and they used a phonetic alphabet, started Anton Berta, Cesar Dora, and those had to be sent immediately to Bletchley Park. All we knew about Bletchley was that they decoded, but we didn't go there, and we only sort of talked to them by telephone or by teleprinter, which was the fastest way you could send written information. And I served at a Yorkshire station, then a station at Lyme Regis that covered western approaches, and finally at one near Dover, which got much the most traffic of the three where I was. And well, we were only 22 miles from the French coast, so there were lots of loud and clear naval messages coming in.
I'd like to come back to you with that in a moment. I'd just like to ask you, Jean, when you got into the position of having an interview with the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, they were asking you lots of questions, and then at the end they asked you a very specific question.
Yes, I was doing quite well up to that point and quite enjoying it, but they were running out of questions. The last specific question was, I thought they're thinking hard now. They said, do you do crossword puzzles? And I thought, they've run out, they can't think of another thing to ask me. And I practically said, no, I wouldn't touch them. But I decided better be honest. And I said, yes, I've always done crossword puzzles. And they said, right, you're in. And I found out later why they wanted to know that.
And there was a real need for secrecy in both of your roles. One of the things that I should mention is you'd both signed the Official Secrets Act, of course without revealing to one another that you'd done so. And Jean, when you were with the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, you were actually serving with SOE, Special Operations Executive, which was a secret organisation, and you were based initially in Baker Street, and they'd asked you all to be very careful on your approach to the building so as not to draw too much attention to it. Could you tell me about one of the steps you took?
Yes, of course, I took this extremely seriously. They mustn't know that this apparently innocent young girl was carrying secrets in her head. So I didn't talk to anybody or anything. But one morning, coming back to the place where I was working, the conductor on the bus suddenly called out, "Any more spies?" And I was horrified. But anyway, nothing I could do about that. And I had to get off the bus.
Yes, because you'd so carefully for weeks been getting off at various different stops to try not to draw attention, and the conductor had actually noticed.
But I
gave the game away.
Not get off because I was due to go working. So I had to just, please God, don't let him think I'm a spy.
And Pat, with your stations, there was very heightened security, particularly when you were down on the south coast at Abbotscliff. Could you talk to me about some of the measures you had to take to not to draw attention to the service?
Well, you were encouraged, I think, to wear civilian clothes more than you would have been in an ordinary branch. So we used to do that. But, of course, we liked to go into Dover or Folkestone in our time off. And dispatch riders would sometimes stop very kindly if you were waiting for a bus and say, would you like a lift? I used to rather dread those journeys because I would be clutching library books, a shoulder bag, a tin hat, a gas mask, and my wren hat, and hanging on for dear life to the dispatch rider's waist while we shot down the hill into Folkestone. You know, it was, on the whole, rather better when a staff car drew up and offered you a lift than when these kind dispatch riders did.
And Jean, for you, the war, apart from obviously the seriousness of your father being a prisoner of war, the seriousness of your job very much dawned around the Christmas of 1943. You worked in a department that was headed by Leo Marx, who many of us will remember for coming up with the special codes that were featured in films like Carve Her Name with Pride and those kinds of films. But while you were working in his department, could you talk to us about that particular Christmas?
Yes. Well, we knew that we were going to be working right through Christmas. It wasn't even a holiday on Christmas Day. We would still be on duty because you couldn't stop the information that was passing backwards and forwards with the underground movements, not just with our army in the continent, but we were working with all the people who were risking their lives working against the enemy undercover. And so we were all sitting up in the working room where we were doing our signal traffic to Europe and getting on with it, but feeling a bit depressed because we weren't with our families, we were working all Christmas Day. However, we tried to make the best of it, and then our boss in charge, whose name I'm afraid I've forgotten.
Well, I was thinking of how you all started to try and wish each other a happy Christmas at the point that Leo Marx came into the room.
That's right, yes, it was Marx. Yes, and he came into the room and looked round at us all, and he said, "Happy Christmas." And we said, "Happy Christmas, Mr. Marx, doing our best." And he said, "It is not a happy Christmas. All over Europe, people are suffering, they are being tortured, they're dying, they're not seeing their families. This is not a happy Christmas." And he walked out of the office again. We all burst into tears, and that was the end of a happy Christmas.
And of course, I remember you telling me that you found out years after the war he'd received the news that his girlfriend had been killed just prior to coming into the office, and
Yes.
he'd been on the roof, I think, at that time.
She was living in Canada, and he'd come back to England, and so they were separated. And yes, and he heard that she had, in fact, I think she'd had an accident and been killed. And so he himself, although he said Happy Christmas, didn't convey this feeling, and I think that's why we dropped it as well. Yes. But it was very sad there.
And Pat, I can't resist, as we've got this HRO here, which is a prime example of the kind of cutting-edge equipment of that time that was used to pick up these frequencies of German surface shipping. Would you give us a sort of mini demonstration of how this worked?
Yes, these were American sets, originally the HROs. We would use headphones, and the dial we used was the central one. We knew the frequencies that the German Navy used, so you would only search up and down the band of the known frequencies. And then, of course, if you came on a signal, it was very often just a carrier wave to begin with, because the Germans tended to warm up their equipment for some time before they actually sent the message. So you would hang on to that, and then eventually they would come up with a call sign, Anton Dora von whatever, and then embark on a message, which, if it was plain language, would immediately be passed on, as I think I said, to naval intelligence, or if it was code, immediately to Bletchley Park. But we spent our nights searching, and if you got a message, everything sort of was on hold while you got it down as accurately as you possibly could. And naval radio traffic tends to be distorted or fade or, not always by any means easy to listen to. We did once have an inspection visit by a senior Wren officer, and it was explained to her the problems that we had with these signals. She said, "Well, if they don't send it very clearly, why don't you ask them to send it again?"
Oh no, that's ridiculous.
Yes.
And actually, it's worth saying intense concentration was required, with listening for up to 8 hours and recording each thing accurately. And I believe you were told if you didn't understand a particular letter to leave it blank rather than try and guess it. But it was, and through the night as well, and also with bombers that would go over to London, or anti-aircraft guns that were firing, or, you know, the war that was going across the Channel. It was quite a noisy place to be, to have to try and listen to.
Oh, it was very noisy at Abbots Cliff because we had an anti-aircraft unit very close to us with very noisy guns. I do remember at one point one of the more naive runs coming into the watchroom saying, "Look what I found," and was carrying a shell. We all said, "Get out," which she did. It was, I think, from our anti-aircraft unit. But there were these bombers coming over. Sometimes we would go and help out the WAF, who were listening to the German Luftwaffe. And of course, they didn't have time to code or anything. The signals were quite different. And they had a game of cowboys and Indians. And the German bombers were cowboys. And they would say, "Achtung, Indianer links," or whatever, meaning there is an English fighter who was an Indianer, coming up. So there was no sort of decoding or anything. You just got the message down or passed it on. But with us, a lot of the messages were sent on to Bletchley to decode.
At that point in 1944, when you were helping the WAF at Biggin Hill, London was suffering its second Blitz, which came to be known as the Baby Blitz, but it was still a very intense Blitz, not like the 40-41 period, but still intense and dangerous, and sort of a pre-runner to the Doodlebugs, which we might come on to in a moment. Could we go back to you, Jean? And you were actually, you volunteered to serve overseas as a young 18-year-old in the middle of a war, didn't you? Could you talk to us about some of the opposition you might have faced?
Well, to say that I volunteered to go overseas is an understatement. I was absolutely desperate that I would take this opportunity of getting out of England. I'd never been out to Scotland. And my father was a prisoner of war by this time in the Far East, so my mother had to cope with looking after this. She didn't know if it was a loss. He might come back, he might not, so she was trying to live a normal life. Pat was getting along all right on the Wrens. Was I entitled to try and get myself into an overseas travel? And luckily, my grandfather was a boy, had gone, young man, I think twice he went around the world. And he knew what it felt like to have the offer of going abroad, being young, and getting away. And so I went back home and pleaded. And in the end, my mother gave way, and I asked her afterwards why, and she said I couldn't put up with it anymore. But I knew it was my grandfather, really, who was saying, let her have a go, why not?
Persistence paid off then.
Paid off.
And could I just ask you, you left a blacked out port in Liverpool on a troop ship and went out in the darkness. Could you tell me about your first impressions as you neared to your destination?
Yes, I'd forgotten about it till you said it, but it was wonderful sailing in the dark because we'd no idea. We knew we were going through a waterlogged area all around Liverpool docks, and then we were out in the coast, and the next thing we knew was we were getting people with Scotch voices coming on board from Glasgow, where we picked up another ship, and they came on to ours, and then we set off out into the Atlantic, and we were heading straight towards America. Well, we had no knowledge at all of where we were going. It could just have been we were being taken out to America, but we didn't. We turned left. We left our convoy. We sailed down, and it got warmer and brighter. We turned left again, and we went through what's the word I want?
Straits of Gibraltar?
Straits of Gibraltar, thank you very much. I've forgotten that one. And there was the great rock of Gibraltar up on the English side, and there were all the lights blazing in the north of Africa. Completely different world. And we sailed all the way through the Mediterranean, and we were guessing all the way, and we finished up in Cairo and Suez Canal.
And Pat, security really tightened as we got closer to D-Day. Could you tell us about some of the increased security around Abbots Cliff and some of the decisions some of you Wrens made at the time?
Yes, well, of course, we were just 22 miles from the French coast. There was always a possibility of the Germans doing a sort of commando raid, and our very isolated house was in rather vulnerable position. So it's the only station where we actually had an armed guard of military police, and they were provided with light machine guns, Sten guns, and we thought, well, if there was a German raid, could we have a go with the Sten guns at helping to defend our station? And they very kindly agreed they would give us a bit of training. You had to start by taking the gun to pieces and putting it together again. And then we had little targets in the field opposite the station, and we would go over there and practice firing at these little targets. And I'm not sure, but I think I may even now, all these years later, remember how you do take apart and put together and fire a Sten gun.
Surely not as a respectable older lady in Chiswick.
No, I don't think perhaps any other old lady in Chiswick would know about using a Sten gun. It's not a very useful thing to know, but these sort of skills stay with you.
Absolutely. And Jean, after some time spent in Cairo, you were moved over to Italy. You were going to be helping to support Allied agents and the partisans in Northern Europe. Could you talk to us about your journey over to Italy?
Yes, I'm afraid I'm making the war sound rather frivolous, but it did have its great moments, especially for a 13-year-old, as well as the ones which were not so great, and some might come to later perhaps. But we could volunteer to go from Cairo, and they did take the people who asked rather than giving you an order. And there were going to be, I think it was either 4 or 6 of us needed. And so they said, well, we're going to fly over to Europe from Cairo. And I said, aeroplanes, I've never been in an aeroplane. And so we duly got in, and I saw that one of the pilots had been on my ship coming out. So he happened to say something, came down to see if we were all right. And he said, oh, it's you. Have you been in an aeroplane before? And I said, no. He said, oh, you better have a look. So he took me up into the pilot's cabin, and there were 2 pilots flying this plane in 2 separate chairs. And he said, could you make room? And one of them stood up, and I sat down in his chair, and I held on to the thing. They did not turn the engine over to me, but I did sit there flying an aeroplane. And they said, well, we're coming down now at Malta, because we haven't had breakfast. It was the middle of the night sometime. So I went down again, and they said, it got a bit bumpy at one point. And I said, oh, no, we didn't go over anything, no, nothing. And so then we went down and we had breakfast and flew on. I was not steering the plane by that time. And flew on to Italy and came down over the southern corner of Italy because the Germans were in the northern half. And it was spring, it was April. And Italy was idyllic. It was absolutely beautiful with blossom out everywhere. People talking happily to each other, walking down the street. It was another world. Lovely.
And Jean, you had a very special sort of qualification with dealing with corrupted messages, and that brings us back to your question about crosswords. What they were really doing was seeing if you had the sort of brain that would tackle these kinds of puzzles. So quite often in your group, you were the one that was given the sort of corrupted messages to work out whether perhaps an agent had fallen into enemy hands, or perhaps was being careless or rushing or something like that. quite a responsibility for an 18 or a 19-year-old.
It was absolutely invaluable because I had the patience as a result of growing up doing crossword puzzles, of sitting up throughout a night session or something like that, wiggling away, trying to get something through. This is important. This man is one of our agents working on the underground movements in Europe, and he's sending a message which needs an answer immediately. Something is happening. I must get this one right. And it was a big responsibility. You knew your life was in danger quite often. But also I found that it was something that you could do and get better at as the more you did it. In the same way that if you put a crossword down and didn't look at it again, you didn't finish it. But with one of these messages, it's in your mind and you come back on duty, and if it hasn't been sorted, you do it and get it right.
And of course, while all of this was going on, your father was in Chung Kai. The rate of deaths was increasing all the time. Starvation and diphtheria, malaria and dysentery. And the conditions in the camp had been, very poor. Your father realised that probably one of the most important things that he could try to do was to raise the morale of the men that were living and dying there. Would you both be able to tell me about some of the steps he took in this? Perhaps if we could start with you, Pat.
Yes, the morale in the camp was very low when he arrived. He decided that they would create a little theatre, and he had sung in musical comedies himself because he had a good tenor voice, and some of the others were talented too. They were brilliant at making musical instruments out of things that nobody else would probably have thought of. And they did have entertainments in the evening, and these men who were half-starved and being sent up to build the railway up to Burma that the Japanese wanted, said what a wonderful relief it was in the evening to come back and sit and watch one of these variety shows that they put on. He was a Christian father and felt that the religious side was very important, and they had a church, they had proper services, and they had very well done funerals, of which there were a great many, and whenever one of these was happening, the men came to attention, and was, all the respect that you could have. The older officers looked after the flowering plants and the care of the cemetery, and there were a lot of things he did, and the thing he probably did that was as important as anything else was to realize that the men were being worked very hard and were on a diet that contained no proper meat, no proper protein. And he got the Japanese to let them have a herd of bullocks. And then after that, they were able to have beef in their diet instead of just vegetables. And altogether, he smartened the whole camp up, and I think probably saved a lot of lives through doing that.
He was absolutely taking his life in his hands when he decided to keep a secret diary. He was getting hold of any paper that he could find and recording daily life in the camp, and hiding it at first in bamboo poles and then later on in a bottle, I think in an oil drum and in a grave. Through his diaries, we're able to get a sense not only of his responsibility for the men, but of the daily conditions, and also of the sort of small acts of heroism that occurred every day. People that retrieved batteries under the wire from people like Boom Pong, the Thai merchant, who accepted credit notes that may never have been paid, perhaps afterwards. But there was a lot of risk and trust, and your father took a great deal of responsibility for the 5,000 or so men that were there I was also very impressed looking through various records and things of the lengths he went to try and keep in touch with families after the war who perhaps had lost sons who hadn't come back. Before we draw to the end of the war, I'd just like you actually, Pat, to give us a bit of a perspective of the atmosphere in Abbots Cliff and around the coast in the build-up to D-Day. What do you remember about that time?
Well, I was at Abbots Cliff for about 6 months before D-Day, and we were aware that there was going to be a landing. We didn't know where. One of the things that happened was that Churchill made a point of being seen in the Dover area several times to get this reported back to Germany and to give them the impression we were going to land in the Pas-de-Calais. One of these occasions, I came out after a night watch, and to my astonishment, coming up over our cliff was a bunch of field officers, and rather unmistakably Monty in his beret, and Churchill, the Prime Minister, and you were supposed to salute these kind of people, only if wearing a hat. And as I was obviously not wearing a hat, all I could do was wave and say, hello, good morning, and they all waved back and said, good morning, and they went up to the edge of the cliff from which you could look straight across at the Pas-de-Calais, and this was one of the devices that Churchill used. I heard he was in the Dover area 5 times in the course of those months, and it was reported back to Germany, and they did expect us to land much further east in France than we eventually did. Of course, before the invasion, there was a lot more happening. There were concentrations of troops, and the air stations were busy. The coastal traffic was more active. So we were not surprised when finally D-Day came, and we watched convoys under our cliff going westward to join the Portsmouth sort of invasion fleet, and we were within range of the German coastal guns, because on one of these convoys we saw them actually hit one of the ships. It was a civilian ship actually, but it burst into flames and then it exploded and it drifted out of the convoy, and the convoy went on with a gap because obviously their orders were you did not stop if this happened. But it was a very sad thing to see a ship actually destroyed. Nobody got off it. But on D-Day itself, I think I was sleeping after a night watch when one of the wrens came rushing around in the early morning saying, started, it started. And of course, a lot of the wrens had a husband or fiancé in the invasion forces. And so we knew it had started, and then after that we had to depend on BBC news bulletins to hear what was happening, because up our end of the channel, 50 miles away from Normandy, we really didn't know whether it was going well or not.
We're very lucky with the book that your father produced, the diary that he kept, that he then adapted to a memoir in the 1950s, that we have so much of daily life in the camp there recorded, and also with the book that you and Jean worked on with Chris Manby, the Codebreaking sisters. We not only have your retrospective views, as we're hearing now, there's unique diary excerpts and letters and things that show your thoughts and feelings at the time. I think we're very fortunate in having those there. while we were talking about D-Day, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that you were recognised for your work that contributed to D-Day with a Légion d'honneur from the French government in 2019. And I know that both you and Jean were reluctant to wear your medals for this talk this afternoon, and I had to persuade you rather to wear them. I thought it sort of made the point to those that aren't aware that how much women were also serving in these vital jobs. And I think in producing and working on a book such as this, I think you're helping to raise the profile of women during the war. I wondered if you could talk to me as we close this talk about memories of VE Day.
Oh, well, I was back in England, wasn't I, for VE Day?
You were.
I think.
Or
no,
were
I
you
wasn't.
Yes.
No, quite right. I'm sorry about that. I was still in Italy, and of course we knew it was coming. All the rumours were there, and then we began to have this signing of documents and so forth. And it just so happened that I had a full day off at one point. We used to get them up once a week or so. And I'd gone with a boyfriend in a car, and we were driving down southern Italy to explore the country a little bit further, and saying, well, I wonder how much longer we're going to be living here. It might end sometime. And we came up onto the top of a slope above Taranto, down in southern Italy. And as we came there was a sudden burst of sound. It was bugles blowing, it was bells ringing, everything was cheering and exciting, and people coming out on the streets in the town below. And we said, that's it. And we turned the car and we went straight down to Taranto, and we joined in. And I had to go back on duty the following morning, but we didn't go to sleep that night. We just celebrated the end of the war. It was wonderful.
And there were very touching letters that you exchanged with your mother as well at that time. That you were, of course, also waiting for VJ Day. I wonder, Pat, do you have any recollections of, first of all, VE Day and then VJ Day?
Well, I think by VE Day, the German fleet had capitulated. And of course, once they did, there was no more work for us intercepting messages. So we were sent up to work at Admiralty in London because in the invasion of Europe, they were bringing back all sorts of technical documents and things, and they needed translators at Admiralty. So this was not as interesting a job as listening to live radio broadcasts. But so I was in London when VE Day came, and of course we were all over the moon and went up to Buckingham Palace, and great crowds of people cheering, and London was full of a great mixture of troops from all over the world and all sorts of people. And of course the only thing was that our family particularly wanted VJ Day.
Of course, by the time that VJ Day had come about, your father had been able to retrieve his diary. A member of the Swedish Red Cross took a photograph of him doing so. Quite a poignant picture. It shows him naturally very much thinner. He brought the diary back with him and then set about creating a sort of a memoir of that time, which he did really in recognition of the men that he'd served with and been with there. So it could be a sort of lasting testament to them. Only the publishers in the 1950s weren't so interested. Perhaps, Jean, could you talk to us about your father's efforts to publish the book?
Well, he, with the help of other people he knew who'd been in the camp, he got in touch with them. He made sure that all the information he'd written down was correct, and any other information that he could get from them. So he had this book here, which was a complete coverage of his experiences and other people's too, and how they handled it. And then he started exploring where he could get a publisher. And he sent it round various ones, and they all came back saying, we don't want this. It was too close to the war. people didn't want to read books about the law, they weren't going to make any money out of it. And I remember going back to the house one day. I was staying up with my parents at that stage, and I saw him standing halfway up the staircase holding the book, and he looked down at me and he said, "They don't want it." And there was no answer I could give him from that. But after he died, he then gave up. Okay, finish, I'm not going to make a thing of this, I'm going to get on with my life, which he did, which was typical of him. But I think, Pat, did you try?
Pat, could you take up the story of then how you were able to get the book published, both of you?
Yes, well, after our father died, our brother inherited everything at our old home, and including the typescript of our father's diary. And it was, in fact, after our brother himself had died, I was in South Africa staying with his widow, and she said, "Have you got a copy of this, or would you like to have one?" And gave me this copy, and I brought it back to England and read it and thought, let's have another go. And I sent it off to the publishers, Pen and Sword, who do military books, and to my delight, about a week later, they said, yes, we would like to publish this book, but the title that he was going to give it was Their Name Liveth, because he very much wanted it to be in memory of the courage of the ones who'd lived and the ones who'd died, and that is what it says on the cross in the cemetery at the camp where he was. The publishers didn't think that was a good selling title, and so it became 1,000 Days on the River Kwai. Seeing he had no experience as an author, I'm very impressed by how well and professionally he divided it into chapters and wrote it and made it such a readable book. I just only wish he knew that it's been sold now for some time and is selling extremely well.
And going into paperback for the VJ Day 75th anniversary. We travelled around a bit giving talks about 1,000 Days on the River Kwai and some enjoyable publicity opportunities and things. And it's been very moving actually to see the audience responses to your father's book and to hear from people that have read the book. I was very keen that you and Jean, having had such interesting wars, should have a book yourselves. Your mother had so carefully kept letters and diaries and things like that. And I was so pleased that you were both open to the idea, and you told your story to Chris Manby, who wrote the book very much in your words from your long sessions of interviews. And it's a real joy to read some of the everyday things that happened in London, some of the anecdotes and your feelings at the time, and then to have your sort of voices coming through the book and looking back on that period. I find it so impressive that it really was a family war effort. Your father, British camp commandant, colonel in the army, both of you with your secret war jobs, both representing two of the most secret organisations, Pat with Bletchley Park, and you have your Bletchley badge on, and Jean, you through the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry with SOE. And I think obviously the other person that we need to mention is your mother, who did so much to keep the home fires burning, but also taking on ARP duties as well. She'd been a servicewoman in the First World War, hadn't she?
She was a land girl, actually, in the First War. And because she could drive, she used to take the vegetable truck into the market and things like that. But she would have written a very good book, only she didn't, and the rest of the family seemed to have done. We're very grateful to Christine Manby for seeing through this book, Codebreaking Sisters, using our diaries and memories and everything to make a good book out of it.
I've been quite careful that we shouldn't give away too much of your story. I think we've given a good overview today, but I really would urge anybody to read these books, to read these fascinating accounts, and to really get a picture of the level of discipline and sacrifice that your very special generation offered. Actually, it's been a real privilege to talk to you today, and I hope my questions haven't been too inept anyway, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, for seeing all these books, and our experiences are kept, going, because I think that it's important people know about the war and what women did in it, and what a difference it made to women's lives, apart from everybody's lives. But thank you so much, for being so interested.
Well, on the point of women's lives, actually, I think one thing I would like to cover before we finish: the war gave you opportunities that you might not have had previously. Could I start with you, Pat? Could you give us a brief overview of some of the extraordinary things you were involved in after the war?
Yes, I went straight from the Wrens to Norway to help staff the embassy, which had to be staffed up again after being in occupied Europe. And like Jean's excitement at going abroad, that was my first chance to get out of the country. And from there, I was lucky enough to go to St Andrews University on a grant paid for by the government, because if you'd been in the services in the war, they would give you a university grant. No woman in our family had ever been to a university, so that was a great plus from having had an interesting service life to get this kind of bonus afterwards. And that led on to a research degree at Oxford and an exchange degree in America. So I had a very enjoyable few years before I finally did get down to being, as I'd always intended, a journalist, and eventually getting married and having a satisfactory later life. But I still keep in touch, of course, with the few remaining German-speaking Wrens I was with in the war, and we tell each other any news or anything.
And Jean, for you had a sort of lifetime filled with travel as well after the war. You spent some time working with Refugee Commission, and afterwards you were a social worker as well in Scotland. And then afterwards you had a very prominent position at Lancaster University as their first...
Yes, well, as you say, first thing I wanted to do was to go abroad again. Once we got my father back and established and life running, and I rang up somebody I heard that was going back into Italy, and he said, right, have you got a passport? Yes. Have you got, what was it, something else, I forget what, about 2 or 3 things. Right, he said, Monday morning, Lancaster platform, and we're going to Italy. So I was staying in Europe for quite a long time, a year or 2 immediately afterwards. And then I went on finding other jobs, and then I became, well, you mentioned something.
At Lancaster University.
That's right, Lancaster University was launched. That's our hometown. And I said, well, better come and have a look at that. So I rang them up and said, I want a job, but it's a short-term one. It does come up for a bit. Like, for instance, do you want somebody to go around telling everyone what a wonderful university you are? And they said, well, let's see about it. And sure enough, for a year or so, I was selling Lancaster University and got bigger and bigger, so that was good. And one thing after the other, and then eventually I went and got married. Well, of course, that's a bit tricky. You can't then go around the world whenever you feel like it. But luckily, he was a professor at the Lancaster University anyway. So we stayed on there, and I did various jobs with them. And
you were their first
old.
careers advisor.
And yes, and then they said, well, you've done so much. Could you talk to the students? And I said, as long as I can say, it's not the end of the world if you feel a failure. if you are not going well at the university, think again, because there are lots of other things. I was never a university student. I've had a wonderful life, and I found that I think I prevented a few suicides in its own way, but certainly they need to have people in the universities who say, don't worry, just enjoy it, because that's the way you're going to get through best. And so I did this for quite a long time, then went and got married late in life, and had a very happy marriage, and working still at the university together.
And in a sense, with these talks and working on these books and things like that, neither of you have sort of enjoyed a particularly quiet retirement. I think you're both actually extremely inspiring, and I'd just like to thank you again so much for talking to me about your experiences, and thank you to Chiswick Book Festival for giving us the opportunity as well.
Well,
Thank you for our audience.
Yes, thank you, Simon, very much for all your tremendous support and interest. And nice to be my second time in Chiswick Book Festival, because I live in Chiswick, and always enjoy it very much.
You moved to Chiswick after revamping University Challenge, didn't you?
Yes, after being at the embassy in Norway and taking several degrees, I got a job as producer of the first series of University Challenge and various other Granada programs, and then moved to the BBC and produced. They wanted a cheap summer series, and I invented one called Ask the Family, which was supposed to run for 7 weeks, ran for 16 years, and worked very happily for BBC television, and eventually retired to Chiswick, where my husband and I had made our home, because the agent said, you know, I think, Mr. Davies, you really need somewhere cheap like Chiswick.
You've been very happy here ever since.
Yes.
Thank you very much.